Welcome back to the yet another interesting panel discussion on no tolerance to corruption, the ABCs of anti-bribery, anti-corruption. India's anti-bribery, anti-corruption regime went through massive changes recently, and after years of deliberation, the Indian Parliament enacted the Prevention of Corruption Amendment Act by bringing new material changes that could really impact the conduct of business in India. We have with us Mr. Prasad Chandran, Professor Arvind Verma, Mr. Ramesh Sharma and Mr. Suhas Tulsapurkar as the panelists for the session. Mr. Ramesh Sharma would be moderating the panel. Before starting with the discussion, I would like to briefly introduce all our panelists. Mr. Prasad Chandran is the former chairman and managing director of BASF India Limited. He was also the chairman of SIBA Limited, Cyanamide India Limited, Pushpa Polymers, etc. Mr. Chandran is the founder chairman of SEGOS, a social enterprise for promoting ethics and fighting corruption. He is currently an independent director on the boards of Bosch Limited, Coromandel International Limited and HDFC Life. In January 2016, Mr. Chandran was bestowed the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany. This is the highest civilian award in Germany for his initiatives in fostering Indo-German relations and for his social welfare activities in India for promoting ethics and better corporate governance. Welcome, sir. We have with us Professor Arvind Verma. He is a PhD in criminology from the Simon Fraser University, Canada. His doctoral work was concerned with analysis of criminal justice data using a variety of mathematical techniques such as fuzzy logic, topology, and fractals. Professor Verma has served as the managing editor of Police Practice and Research, an international journal, and he has also been an advisor to the Bureau of Police Research and Development in India. His current research interests are in policing, criminal justice police issues, Indian police, research methods, mathematical modeling, and many more. His recent book, co-authored with Mr. Ramesh Sharma on combating corruption in India, published by Cambridge University Press, is recently launched in Delhi on 6th of October 2018. Welcome, Professor Verma. We have our very own Mr. Ramesh Sharma, who is currently an executive director at Legacy Services Private Limited. He was a former Indian police service officer with 35 years of distinguished service. Mr. Sharma held senior positions in multiple challenging environments relating to law enforcement, investigation of high-profile frauds and corruption bribery cases, internal security, counter-terrorism, and insurgency at international, national, state, and grassroots levels. His most recent book, co-authored with Professor Arvind Verma on combating corruption in India, is published by Cambridge University Press, which is recently launched in Delhi on 6th of October 2018. Mr. Sharma will also be moderating the panel. We also have Mr. Suhas Tulsapurkar, the managing partner of Legacy's Partners and a founder director of Legacy Services Private Limited. Having worked as an in-house counsel, Mr. Suhas has a clear understanding of corporate requirements and lawyers' predicaments. He has pioneered various IT-enabled legal support solutions like Legatrix, Roznama, Karar that add value and immense value to the legal services. Welcome all of you on the stage.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know how interesting this session is going to be because corruption and bribery, to my experience as an IPS officer, has been that normally people don't like to talk about it, don't like to discuss about it. But unfortunately, now a kind of situation has arisen in this country with the enactment of the Prevention of Corruption Amendment Act 2018, which has yet to be notified, that the supply side has also been criminalized. In other words, the bribe giver also is liable criminally. And bribe giver can be in the form of an individual, or it can be a commercial organization. So to say, the two sides of the coin are now complete, because hitherto in the Prevention of Corruption Act 1988, it was only the public servants who were criminally liable. And for the bribe giver, we had to use sections like criminal conspiracy under section 120B IPC and abatement sections. But now, this is why this is a very watershed moment, according to me, from my enforcement perspective. In fact, let me just give you an outline how we intend to proceed about the whole discussion. While I would like to give you my enforcement perspective, Mr. Chandran would give you the corporate perspective, Professor Verma would give you the criminological perspective, and of course, Mr. Suhas Tulsapurkar will present the side of the lawyers, the legal side. So just to briefly initiate the discussion, to give you the perspective of the topic as to why it has been chosen and why we are, as a company, as Legasis, we are insisting that this matter should be discussed and debated, is that as an enforcement officer, I feel it is an watershed legislation. That it is first time that now the private sector is going to be liable, and it has grave implications. So there have been certain phase savings, we will discuss this, that if certain adequate measures are taken, put in place, then the government or the enforcement agencies would take that into consideration if there is a commission of a crime of bribery or corruption. So this in nutshell is the background in which this is being held. And I would also like to draw your attention to the international perspective. Internationally also, in fact, if we see the Prevention of Corruption Act, all those who are here from multinational agencies and to whom the US FCPA is applicable, or UK, United Kingdom Bribery Act is applicable, and if you see the Prevention of Corruption Act, you will see that it is almost like very similar acts, the same ingredients, even the same language has been kind of transported. For example, the very crucial term, two crucial terms in the entire legislation, undue advantage, is a term that has been borrowed, that is there in the UKBA, and in FCPA it is unfair advantage. So the entire law also is, that has been legislated, has been the treaty and convention obligation of Government of India, because it has ratified the United Nations Convention Against Corruption Treaty Convention, and therefore it is duty bound to import the framework that has been prescribed by this international organization into our own legislations. So with this opening remarks, I would now request Mr. Chandran to perhaps say something from the corporate point of view.
Thank you, Mr. Sharma, and good afternoon to you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sure most of you have many stories and anecdotes about corruption, and every one of you will have and would have faced in your lives, somewhere or the other, the necessity to question, should I pay and come out, or should I fight the system? Well, in everyday life, when you face corruption, that could be coercive corruption, where the powers are not equal. For example, if there was a road accident and you were involved in it and you had to quickly file an FIR, and if the police station there took his own time or they would not do it, and if there was a demand on it, The rules at one point of time said that you had to immediately, unless you file the FIR, the next steps cannot take place. And if there was a cost to file the FIR, you had a dilemma. However, when it came to collaborative corruption, it's a completely different game. In collaborative corruption, the giver and the taker both benefit. And in collaborative corruption, both have equal powers. In the sense, the taker of corruption in the act could be somebody who has the discretion in law. And the giver could be somebody who gains and enhances his capital by the act of working together. That's collaborative corruption. Worldwide, till 2005, across the globe, even though United Nations Coalition Against Corruption had discussed this matter for many long, the G7 countries, the leaders of the G7 had not brought in corruption as a standalone factor for multinationals to operate. Post-2007, corruption was included. And there onwards, some of you may be aware that large multinationals which operated across the globe, they used to run 3 sets of global compliances. One set of compliance, because if you wanted to operate in all these countries, it was not possible to operate with one set of compliances. So the 3 sets of compliances were: one for the developed world, which meant United States, Germany, Japan, the developed world. The second set of compliance, of course this was confidential, nobody told you. If you went into the headquarters in New York or Frankfurt or London, no chairman will share this with you, but every board member of a multinational or a transnational was aware that there were 3 compliances. So first was for the developed world, second was for the monarchies, the King of Saudi Arabia, Brunei. Now these kingdoms had their own rules, and if you wanted to do business, you had to do rules as per the kingdom. And third was a category called most corrupt countries. And these, unfortunately for our egos, India was included in this category. So you had China, you had India, and all these countries, Indonesia, and all of them who were considered that you cannot do business without being corrupt. I'm just giving you a background for you to understand how serious and how we look at the changes that have taken place, the international aspect of it, which has forced India and the politicians in India to change the laws. Because G7 then dictated that they cannot run 3 compliances. It has to be only 1 compliance across the globe. And that is what has necessitated the changes that are taking place. However, in the Prevention of Corruption Act 1988 and the current amendment which Mr. Sharma just mentioned to you, there has been very clever and very astute changes brought in by the bureaucrats, by which government officials are now completely excluded in the context that you cannot start investigations against a government official unless you have taken the permission from the appointing or dismissing authority. However, on the other side, Section 8 and 9, the giver has become a criminal offense. Not only the individuals, but also the organizations. Now, this is very serious, and most of the managing directors and chief executives are not even aware of these amendments that have taken place. This is serious because given the level of corruption in the country, as of now, there is no protection. Because the act is quite open, they only mentioned that adequate measures have to be prescribed. As Mr. Sharma mentioned to you, the law as is passed is a cut and paste job from the UK Bribery Act. But they have conveniently dropped the aspects on the protection that the UK Bribery Act gives to honest corporations. Therefore, of course, now this has been taken up by the industry associations, and each one of you who are involved should work and should canvass to make sure that the adequate measures are included. And one of the objectives of this seminar would be to spread this message and get across to each one of us to contribute towards making the adequate measures part of the rules as and when they are made. Just one line before I move on to into the panel discussion. I want to say that we can always look at any event from a risk and an opportunity point of view. And I want to see this landmark judgment, this watershed judgment, as Mr. Sharma rightly mentioned. You have to see this as a possibly a change for the country, change for the better. Let us from the corporate side lead this fight against corruption. Because by criminalizing corruption from the giver, you now have a very strong point moment any demand comes to you. Every professional in an organization must now stand up. And if the organization or the managing director or the owner or the capital asks a professional to indulge in any such acts, he can bring up this particular act and say that it is not possible, I will not be part of it. And if you are able to do that, we will start the process of fighting corruption, reducing corruption. And by this way, this will be a unique proposition to strengthen the Indian economy. For us, one of the major factors by which I think we can get ahead of China over a period of time. China, as you know, is a huge economy now, but this is one factor which will differentiate India from China. And I wish that we look at this as an opportunity and cover the risk. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly it's a very, very big opportunity because, as I said, I mean, the lawmakers certainly know what they are doing. Let's at least give it to them. Because they know that if business has to come to India and if we have to have our development and growth and we have liberalized, we would need to provide that kind of a secure environment in terms of anti-bribery and anti-corruption also, besides many other factors. So there were very practical points that were brought out by Mr. Chandran. I would now turn myself to Mr. Tulsapurkar Suhas. You run this, you are the brain behind this Legasis company that you have built, which I personally feel it was a kind of avant-garde before its time. People even thought of that lawyering and IT could be fused, could be put, that laws could be put on platform and the compliance would take place. What do you think? Because this is, as you will agree with me, and we have privately discussed and agreed many times, that this is indeed a watershed legislation, and that the private sector is going to come into sooner or later, maybe, going by your statement that bomb blasts take place in J&K and we don't think that it can happen next door. But now it is going to happen next door, it may happen in our own house. What do you think, according to you, with your experience in the compliance zone, how the private sector should be preparing itself for this kind of an act?
Thank you, sir, and thank you, Mr. Chandran. For kind of laying down, the topic correctly and it's in its correct perspective as a watershed legislation. You see, till now the Indian corporate sector was thinking that there is a huge element in the kind of criminal jurisprudence called mens rea, that you attribute an intent, and intent has to be attributed somewhere within the organization. When the first bill was introduced, I think we slightly moved away from the mens rea concept to say that if you have benefited out of corruption, the onus of proving mens rea was not on the enforcement, was on the enforcement, or was not on the enforcement, and how did that onus shift from one place to other place? So obviously a prima facie evidence was good enough for enforcement authorities to say that there has been an incidence of corruption and an offense took place. Through the two judgments of the Supreme Court, I think it became very clear that Supreme Court laid down saying mens rea has to be established and the onus continues to remain on the enforcement agencies. The bill which was not culminated into the enactment which came into being, slightly shifted this onus to say that what was the criteria for laying down the prima facie manner in which the enforcement would discharge its onus, and moved it back, large part of the onus moved back onto the corporate sectors or the individuals from the supply side of corruption. So if the organization gave bribes, actually it was the enforcement agencies, and it's still under the present act as it stands, the enforcement agency has to prove the intent with those individuals from the corporate sector who actually gave the bribe, irrespective of the fact that yes, bribes were given or taken, and that the organization kind of enriched, or it was undue influence that was there at the transaction level. Mens rea issue still remains a problem in this enactment. But, and I'm trying to say this very clearly, is that that cannot be the reason why the corporates today should say, at least at the top level, that we will have this defense as we move forward. To the extent that the tone at the top needs to be very, very clear now, that it's crime to pay bribes. If it is crime to pay bribes, the organization will not pay it. And I think from that perspective, yes, you look at it as an opportunity to kind of, for facilitating a growth, or as Mr. Chandran said, it's kind of, we want to move towards or be a larger economy than China, that this is one aspect of the economy that will, if it is taken care of, will have a remarkable growth that India can experience. But the mens rea issue still continues. The coercive corruption that we talked about, a very, very kind of, if I were to put it this way, juvenile provisions have been made in the enactment to say that if you have paid a bribe, if a corporation is forced to pay a bribe, or individuals in corporations are forced to pay a bribe, they need to report back to their local police station or enforcement authorities within 7 days. Even if you have, while crossing the traffic light, paid a bribe to the cop standing there, you are not going to go back to the police station and report. Forget about the large crimes that would take place. So I think it's a bit of a juvenile provision that has crept in there. And I would again want to step back and look at United Nations Convention. And I think say this, that this enactment that has been brought in is probably not fulfilling all the treaty obligations that India as kind of a nation or the state undertook with the United Nations Treaty. And to that effect, it falls very short of the international expectations on India on the corruption. While on the different hand from the corporate sector, if we are saying that we need to have adequate measures in place, which will mean anti-bribery, anti-corruption compliance, policies, statements, all the 10 hallmarks of compliance program got to be brought in there, but that's not going to be enough. And surely there are provisions which are lopsided, one-sided, and that's why probably, one, the amendment is probably too late. It's also too little, because I don't think it will curb corruption.
Yeah, sure enough, but being a cop that I am, hard-boiled, the fact is that law is there. I mean, the moment it gets notified. And no doubt, I mean, we've had a number of discussions. In fact, today I'm not a government servant, so I can take the liberty of saying that this is perhaps a law which tells you how a law should not be written. It is that, it's that badly written law. But whatever it is, it is. And the corporate sector has to think about it, the adequate measures that it has to take, and how to put policies in place that, there are no incidents. And if there are incidents, how you quickly respond to it, whether you have your whistleblower policies, whether you have your gifts and hospitality policies. All these are not far cries now. They are part of the law, and maybe government will be soon giving out guidelines regarding what steps can be taken by the corporate world, which will be taken into consideration if any such kind of incident happens. But without going into those other theoretical aspects as to why, no doubt, I mean, I totally agree with Mr. Chandran, I agree with Suhas also, that the act is heavily loaded in the favor of the government servant, the public servant, because I also feel, even from the legal point of view, that at the very stage of the complaint, if the public servant is recommending an action or taking a decision in discharge of public duty or public function, therefore any complaint arising out of it has to be referred to the government for the appropriate authority to give its approval, I think is going a bit too far, because that would again be impinging on the rights of the investigating officers of investigating a crime, cognizable crime, when it is reported to it. But what I can see, Suhas, and I come back to Arvind here, that it is going to be maybe a funny kind of a situation where you see, because there is no protection available, because in collaborative bribery, as Mr. Chandran pointed out, there has to be a giver, there has to be a taker. Now, if the giver is being punished because there is no permission required, you might find a situation where the taker, the permission is not forthcoming from the government. So you have only half the side of the prosecution that is taking place. So as I said, things over the period of time when it goes to the court, I'm sure certain changes, amendments will come across, and maybe these issues will be discussed and debated, and judgments will come on this issue itself. But without going into all that, now I turn myself to Professor Arvind Verma, who's been an IPS officer as well as a criminologist. What do you reckon from the criminology point of view, given I'm talking about this specific situation where we have this act coming into existence for the corporate world, how do you think from the criminology perspective, at the organizational level, they should be dealing with it, preparing themselves for it?
Thank you, Suhas, and thank you, Ramesh, for giving me this opportunity. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm really enjoying the sessions, very, very educative for me personally. What I want to do is, in order to answer what Ramesh has specifically asked, I think I'd like to present a few short case studies and try and illustrate how bribery in particular and corruption in general has been handled in police agencies from one or two specific examples, which will help me draw lessons for the in general for other organizations also. Coming to the specific act, Ramesh, as you are trying to say, of course that act has still to come in force, so we don't really know what the final shape is probably going to be, and some of the conclusions that you are drawing is obviously very clear that that act doesn't seem to be really going to prevent corruption. It may perhaps even promote many other avenues, because the public official is going to be sheltered now. So that is, of course, probably not the intention. But what really happens is that law should always be seen as a kind of a boundary, that thou shalt not do this. So there's a kind of a boundary, and transgression of that boundary is going to be leading you towards prosecution. And therefore the idea is that you need to sort of keep in mind that there is a boundary and below which you need to operate. So if you take it as a kind of a moral boundary that thou shalt not indulge in corruption and bribery, that's fine. But what really happens is that in practice, when the law is framed, it gets framed in a particular way where it tends to prohibit certain acts, leaving many other actions sort of ungoverned and unstructured, which opens several new avenues. An example of that comes to my mind that when I was city SP in Patna, I had a very dynamic senior SP called Mr. Kishore Kunal. And the two of us sort of cracked down, and we tried to act very independently, and we made some dent in trying to sort of build a semblance of lawful society in Patna, whatever we could do. But what we found was very interesting, that the consequence of that was that amongst the police station staff, we began to hear something called Kunal tax, and which was that officers started demanding higher rates of extortion because they said कि Kunal साहब आ गए, Verma ji आ गए हैं, and if we get caught, then we'll lose a job. So therefore, if you really want this to be done, or whatever there is, there's now going to be a higher tax. So it sort of had a very different kind of a perception. Economists, therefore, sort of very rightly point out that bribery is a kind of a rent extraction, and it happens because the public official has extraordinary discretion in trying to take a decision of this way or that way, or trying to delay and on, which happens because, particularly in India, because we give a monopoly to the government and public officials in many spheres of life. So if you have a monopoly, there's no accountability, you have a lot of discretion, then clearly you're going to open avenues for bribery and corruption that takes place. Coupled with that, if there is a weak prosecution and delay in trial and punishment, then of course there is hardly any deterrence to the public officials to indulge in that. So keeping that in mind, I want to sort of go back again to the last panel where I had given an overview of theories of crime, because in criminology we study how crime takes place, and therefore we try and find avenues through which it can be controlled. And again, as I mentioned, that is a lot of lessons for this particular type of crime also. Corruption and bribery is also a form of crime. And therefore, theories of opportunity and situational crime prevention and routine activity and crime prevention through environmental design, many of these perspectives have lots of applicability in trying to deal with bribery and corruption in our sphere. Let's take the example. For instance, we all know, and in fact, I was very surprised when I joined the police service, and I think Ramesh was also with me here. We came to Mumbai and we met Mr. Ribeiro, who was the Commissioner of Police here in Mumbai, and we were discussing with him, and he very frankly said that, there is hafta taking in the Mumbai police, and it's very difficult to deal with it. And we were quite surprised because, he was obviously a very decorated officer, and as young probationers, we found that, well, this seems to be an acknowledged fact, and nothing seems to be done about it. Now, how does really police officers get this opportunity to be corrupt? And there are only a limited number of ways in which they really sort of get their cuts. One, as we all know, is in question of registration of an FIR. There's a lot of discretion that law gives to the SHO, that if a cognizable case is reported to the SHO, then he shall record it in writing and therefore register a case and under a particular section, which is again dependent upon him. So that discretion is one that sort of gets misused very, very quickly. The other aspect is in terms of making an arrest. That police officers have been empowered under a variety of sections that they can make an arrest on flimsy grounds or on special grounds, because the law says that if it is in the opinion of the police officer that a person is likely to commit a crime, then the police officer has power to go and make that arrest. Or if a person suspects, that a police officer suspects that somebody has been involved in a crime, then again, the law empowers them to make an arrest. And we have sections like 151 CRPC, where a police officer can virtually detain almost anybody under any small pretext and keep them confined for 24 hours. So with those kind of a broad guidelines, definitely they are going to be misused. We also have very, phenomena of what I call cultural roots. Now, the Indian police was defined, Indian criminal justice was designed as a method of oppression by the British to keep the population down. With a very few number of IP officers, they were able to sort of establish their Raj and keep it in control by using police as a coercive tool. And we haven't made any changes. That particular culture prevails, And therefore, in one of my paper, I described cultural roots of corruption in police in India, because what is happening is that there's complete unaccountability, particularly at the senior level, and there's a lot of opportunity. So also that gets translated, and it sort of starts flowing down, that if there is a person who is corrupt at the top, then clearly he or she has very little moral standing to stand up for corruption of his own subordinates. Which therefore brings me to an important point, and I'm going to quote a great poet in Patna, whom I knew personally, unfortunately has died, who wrote in one of his poems a small line which sort of sticks to my mind. He said that, अगर एक भी आदमी, if only one person, एक भी आदमी अगर व्यवस्था के खिलाफ तन कर खड़ा हो जाता है, if even one person stands firmly against establishment, तो व्यवस्था अपने आप चूर होकर गिर जाती है. The establishment sort of falls down. And that example comes remarkably from a police officer in New York whose name was Serpico. Frank Serpico was a police officer in NYPD, a patrol officer who found that at that time, NYPD was as bad as any other Indian police force. There was extortion, there was bribery taking, there was organized sort of methods in which the police officers were virtually looting from the people and from the businesses. And Serpico would not stand for that, and he stood up, he started making complaints. When senior officers did not listen, then he went even higher up, then he went to New York Times, and it was his personal commitment and at a great risk for himself that finally there was a lot of outcry which led to the Knapp Commission to look into corruption within the NYPD. So therefore, as Mr. Chandran has said, and again Suhas has also pointed out, that even one single person can actually make a difference. So that is one. The other point is that coming from the criminological perspective, if you are able to understand what the situation is, how an opportunity is created, and if you have some ways of trying to control that, then definitely crime can be controlled. So this was one experiment that I tried. I was posted at SP Dumka. Jharkhand was part of Bihar at that time. And Dumka is a very quiet district, tribal district, not much of sort of a very serious consequences as we see in other parts of Bihar. So I could exercise a lot of personal supervision out there. And one of the ways in which I did was that I made sure that officers will not have the liberty to arrest. I said, illegally you have a power to make an arrest, law gives you that power, but as a superintendent police, I'm going to take away that power. If you find somebody committing a crime directly in front of you, well, fine, you must arrest, there's no doubt. But otherwise, you will collect the evidence, you will seek my permission or my additional SP's permission, and only then will you make an arrest. So of course, there was a lot of hue and cry, sir, what happens, if offenders don't fear us, then we will not be able to commit, we will not be able to control crime, and all kinds of excuses are made. But I sort of stood firm. And I think I didn't really have the empirical sort of scientific background at that time to make a kind of a value judgment to see how well it was operating. But the feedback that I got was that by and large people perceived that the police there was less corrupt and there was sort of more satisfaction with the way my police was functioning. This has been done again in a remarkable way by NYPD, which I want to bring to your point. When the Knapp Commission came, then the police commissioner, Mr. Patrick Murphy, decided to sort of say that, well, let's also take some action. Otherwise, the Knapp Commission will probably lead to some very drastic consequences for himself and for his police force. So he also studied and tried to find out what are the areas, what are the situations where NYPD officers are sort of really getting very corrupted. And what he found was that it was the sort of enforcement of Gambling Act. Because Gambling Act was one where the law was so structured that it is illegal because you need a license to gamble, but everybody wants to gamble. And people will run illegal gambling joints in various basements and here and there, which police officers knew, and they would extort money. And there was a good amount of money that was sort of being done in illegal betting and gambling. So it really corrupted the officers in a serious manner. So what Mr. Patrick Murphy did was, he said, okay, what I'm going to do is, I'm not going to enforce this law. So he debated for a while whether police have the power not to enforce a law. We are given power to enforce a law, but can we say we will not enforce this law? So he was worried that if he makes us this kind of a rule, then probably there will be some consequences for him. But he stuck to his gun saying that, well, this is a really a serious situation, so I'm going to enforce this by forcing my officers that we are not going to enforce the Gambling Act in New York from henceforth. And he passed that order, gave it in writing, supervised, made sure that nobody really enforces the Gambling Act unless until there's such a big thing that it will be done under a senior officer under very supervised condition. And lo and behold, that began to have an impact, which is what we have sort of really looked into. So the last point is that, I'm sorry, I think I have to keep it close to me, which is that those particular sort of instances where officers have that opportunity to be corrupt need to be studied, and therefore designs have to be evolved which can help control that, which is not very difficult, and it can be done, as I've been sort of talking about that. The second, obviously, is a much more serious one, which is that people who are involved, people who are concerned, they themselves have to be absolutely clean, have to follow this path of righteousness, and stand against any kind of a deviance. So if you stand up against that, then clearly that has a cascading effect. And you can build that particular kind of a culture. This comes from an example of Germany and Japan, where the two police forces have a very high degree of probity and integrity, not because of any sort of a tight enforcement, but because underground a culture has been built up. Again, in a case study, an example, American police, despite Knapp Commission and everything else, remains very corrupt. And one way the corruption starts is what we call a free coffee syndrome. Police officers start their duties as the patrol officers, and then of course they will go and try to have coffee in some particular McDonald's or some other restaurant, and they will be given free coffee. Sometimes they want to pay, but the establishment will say, oh, this is free on you, and on, and they start off. Many of my students actually work in many of these restaurants, and they also report, yes, sir, we see the officers come, and we are told we should not charge these particular officers. And I say, well, this is very interesting. Many of them feel that, well, sir, this is not really corruption. Come on, you're just giving him a cup of coffee. That's not really corrupt practice. This is not bribery and something. But I say, ask yourself a question, that if a police officer comes and you're giving him coffee, but he also wants to have donut with that, if he wants to have a pastry with that, are you going to be charging for the pastry and say that you will not, you're giving coffee free, but pastry is not on the house? And that is what we call a slippery slope. So again, the Knapp Commission came up with this particular thing, that there are grass eaters who start off really in a very small way, and very soon they become meat eaters, that they become very big extortionists. So if we cut it down right at the sort of initial level, it has that kind of an effect that I was talking about, which is what German and Japanese police have done. They have a standing rule that a police officer in uniform, you will not go out and have coffee anywhere. If you want to have coffee, you come back to the station, but you will not have drink coffee anywhere or eat anything outside. And therefore, that particular sort of cascading effect is simply stopped. Japan has gone one other step, which is that they have created this particular culture, and that culture is of high sort of sense of belonging to that corporation, and having the sense that if I act in a deviant way, it brings shame not only to myself, not only to my family, but to my big organization also. And that is very important. So that culture, therefore, acts as a big deterrent in trying to control bribery.
Thank you, Arvind. I think what Arvind is trying to, can you hear me? What Arvind has tried to say through his experiences is exactly whether there is a situation where there is an opportunity. And I think all of you in your organizations know where the situations are, where the opportunities lie, and where are the loopholes. So it is this idea of just kind of plugging that. I think if any of the panelists have any comments, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just want for those of you who are the key managerial personnel, what the Companies Act 2014 now defines as the KMP. Now, those of you who are KMP or those who will get into the KMP position, the Companies Act 2014, along with the current existing laws that exist, every one of you must be aware of and take some time off to understand the implications of the Companies Act with the current amendment in the Prevention of Corruption Act. Because while this is done to prevent corruption, if any of the agencies try to increase their remuneration by way of using this act, the risk to you is hugely increased. Because the KMP, which is the key managerial personnel under the Companies Act, has direct responsibility. And for all listed companies, as you are aware, you have the audit committee and the risk committee. The audit committee and the risk committee, as also the other committees like the CSR committee, all have to be chaired by an independent director. And you currently know that lots of activities have taken place because so far these were all statutes in paper. Number of meetings have taken place where records would be kept and all minutes of the meetings have been written in 3 to 4 weeks. There are companies where there are no records of the board meetings kept, and only when there is a particular issue you find that backdated records are kept. Please make sure all such things of the past. Because now the Companies Act 2014 combined with this Prevention of Corruption Act exposes you to a lot of risks. And therefore the key managerial personnel, it is impertinent for them to oversee and make sure that any demand that comes in has to be reported back and nipped in the bud. And how do you combat when a chief minister or the most powerful minister in the cabinet of that state where you have a manufacturing plant, or where a project has been put up and it has come to the commissioning stage? At that stage, if the most powerful minister or the chief minister who has the home portfolio with him, and mostly in all states, the chief minister has the home portfolio or his coalition partner has the home portfolio. And the DGPs and the police and all the investigating agencies in the state work as per their orders. And if you get a phone call, always it is in Thursday or Friday morning, and the risk of it gets multiplied. So please make sure that the chances of a company getting into trouble with agencies has multiplied a number of times. There are a number of agencies which look at the market forces and what happens to the share prices in the market. And there is a fair amount of doubt in the minds of the bureaucracy that most companies are indulging in corrupt practices. That is, our socialist economy has brought in a certain sense of feeling that most companies are corrupt and they do undertake corrupt practices. Therefore, what has happened to IL&FS, for example, how could you believe that an organization like this, the committees have not met for so many years? Now suddenly, whenever I talk to any bureaucrat now, they say, look, what happened to Satyam, what happened to IL&FS? But what about the number of companies where honestly everything is being done and our work is getting more and more difficult? Honest companies are finding it extremely difficult. However, I want to just rest this case that we have to be from the corporate side, look at it positively, be very careful and make sure that you do not become no professional, whether you're a chartered accountant, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're business management, make sure that you will not be a party to any form of corruption. And this is important from your point of view because when an organization gets into difficulty, no individual, they will always find some professional to whom the axe is bound. And therefore, and in future, you will go under criminal liability so that your personal assets will all be frozen within 24 hours. Therefore, my warning to you is professionals must keep off and let the ownership, let the business owner, let the capital find out how we will deal with the situation. but by a professional taking a stand, we will be able to curtail corruption, look at it positively, and work on it on a positive manner.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chandran. As I was saying, I mean, I have actually made a study of this, collected data of 13 years of economic offences wing, and in fact, that is what we published in that book, Combating Corruption in India, which Arvind and I have written. And the whole thing comes out that a closure of a case takes 20 years. 4 years in investigation, 8 years in the trial court, 4 years in the High Court, 4 years in the Supreme Court. 20 years of the best part of your life is over, if anything happens. And that is why perhaps, Suhas, I think one of the reasons why we are holding this kind of a conference is, we always believe that prevention is better than cure. I'm sorry for using such a cliche, but it describes it well. That it is, if we start taking steps right now within our companies, within our places, we know where exactly things are happening and we start blocking them. Maybe a stage will not come, because once, let me be very clear as an enforcement officer, or rather an ex-enforcement officer, once an FIR is registered, I think God forbid, life turns into hell. It turns into hell, because then the whole lot of criminal justice system is set into motion, which, as I said, takes 20 years for a closure. Whatever be at the end of it, you say whether I get guilty or acquitted, please give me the judgment, I don't give a damn either way. Would you like to add something to this, Suhas?
No, thank you, sir. I just wanted to take cue from Mr. Chandran. You see, we are seeing that there are companies today who are falling apart. There are large brands that we have looked at. These are companies that, while we grew it in the corporate sector, we thought companies like ILFS. I'm not going to name the others because they're still standing, they're shaky, but they're still standing. But the fact remains that today, I think the Indian corporate sector, or India Inc., is under tremendous pressure on various fronts. And one of the very critical fronts is the individuals getting caught, individuals getting arrested, allegations against individuals and various illegalities and crimes being committed. And let's look at who these individuals are. These individuals are professionals like you and me, who kind of work to the best of our ability, give professional advice. And I think that's where, when Mr. Chandran said that it's the chartered accountants, it's the company secretary, it's the advisors who are probably more vulnerable today than at any point in time. Again, looking back at the amendment, sir, I want to make 3 points here. One is, today I think the Indian corporate sector is still on the corruption issues in what we call as a mode of denial.
Absolutely.
There is no admission of the fact that yes, my organization is corrupt. I think that's the first realization that ought to come, because then you will recognize that this is a problem, and then you will try to do something about it, including taking adequate measures to prevent it. The second aspect is, and that's where I think the new Amendment Act kind of makes it very, very clear, that any corruption through a third party will also be a corruption that would be attributable to the parent company. So you may call your distributor or a dealer on a principal-to-principal basis. You may not have principal-to-agency relationship, but still you will be held responsible if your dealer, if your third party entertains corruption and bribe, because you are eventually going to get benefited. And this kind of opens up a huge kind of an issue today. I want to just narrate one example. When we were taking a class on anti-bribery and anti-corruption at one place, we said, yes, adequate measures would mean 10 hallmarks of compliances. This also probably means standards such as ISO 37001 standards. And we took a kind of an immediate survey. We said, how many of you are aware about this problem and would want ISO 37001 certification from yourself as your company? Most of the people said, yeah, we will think about it in next 1 year's time, next 2 years' time, next 6 months' time. Yes, we've talked about it. Yes, we want to know more about it. And when we actually put the question to every one of them to say that, Do you want your third parties to have this ISO 37001 certification so that anti-bribery and anti-corruption systems in your third parties is actually implemented correctly? Everyone said, yes, we want our third parties to be compliant with these standards on anti-bribery, anti-corruption. So when it comes to others, on the anti-bribery and anti-corruption, you are saying, I have to be holier than thou. When it comes to yourself, I think the corporates are saying, okay, we'll think about it. It's not hit me as yet. Nobody in my organization has gone behind the bars. Now look at a situation when a chairman and managing director of Punjab National Bank goes behind the bar or is terminated on the last day of her retirement. I think there is something that we need to worry about. When you look at a chairman and a managing director of a large nationalized bank being arrested for a NPA account in which he doesn't even have the oversight, I think crime is being attributed at the topmost level today. And as Mr. Sharma rightly said, thereafter, for 20 years, you are in this entire mill that will kind of ensure your career is lost. The amendment in true sense would mean, while who has taken a bribe will probably be prosecuted later, who has given bribe today needs no permission, doesn't have any defenses such as best judgment defenses. Bribe givers, which is the corporate sector now under the amended act, would straight away face the prosecution. It will start off with probably a preliminary inquiry which has no sanctity of a legislative enacted law but as court judgments, common law principles. From preliminary inquiry onwards, you will be stuck there for 20 years as a bribe giver. And who will be stuck? Everybody in the organization who ever had any nexus to that allegation of bribe having been given. Yes, there will be honest companies who will be prosecuted. Yes, there will be political agenda behind it. But the fact remains that today when we say why we are saying there has to be no tolerance or zero tolerance to the corruption and bribery, it is from this perspective we are saying. And we are articulating it in a manner in which we are saying, forget about your defenses that may be available to you in law. Forget about anything else that anyone will advise you. Is the zero tolerance to corruption. That's the only way that a corporation would get saved from preventing arrest, preventing prosecution, preventing enforcement action.
Thank you very much, Suhas. So basically, we are all one of the view that it goes much beyond the law. And it is basically the ethical culture that has to be developed and generated. Even Arvind talked about it, and my other panelists also talked about it, and I'm also talking about it. So it ultimately comes back to Suhas, as I can quote you from that oft-quoted slogan that we have on our compliance, and it has to be compliance by choice. That it has to come from within. I mean, if it is just question of managing, playing with the act, as to what kind of adequate measures can I put in place and therefore I will be able to get away with it, or whether I get ISO 37001 certification and I'll get away with it, I'm sorry, that those are not the shortcut remedies. But be that as it may, I think we in the panel have taken longer time than we intended to. Hope you've enjoyed the discussion. I throw the discussions open. Anybody can please get up, comment, ask questions, whatever you have. Can somebody take the mic there, please?
I am Madan Mohan. I am from Tata AIA Life Insurance Company Limited. I am taking care of compliance. I wanted to understand root causes of the corruption. Whether a person with prone to corruption basis need or is a psychological factor. This is what I would like to understand. My next query is, a person will prone to corruption due to not brought in ethical environment. Is it my statement is true? Thank you.
What is it? I didn't understand. I didn't get.
I think you have asked a very good question, which is who really becomes a criminal, or why somebody is a criminal, why somebody becomes corrupt. Is it because of lack of ethical issues or something? The correct answer to that is that we don't really know. And the reason we don't really know, that as criminologists, we don't really want to know, because otherwise we'll be out of business. So on that nice note, there's a routine activity approach that I talked about in the panel in the last panel, which essentially suggests that just the way the routines are created by how we go, where we live, how we work, and in what circumstances we interact, etc., that begins to create the opportunities for various type of crime. So if you are dealing with some setting up an industry, or you're trying to buy a land, or you're trying to transport something, then there are various agencies in which you routinely will have to interact, and it is then that routine interaction where opportunities for corrupt behavior will emerge, and that can take place when there is a lack of guardianship. So what really happens is that people who are indulging in routine activities are like you and me. We both have our routines, and our routines interact in a certain situation, in a certain place, and if there's a lack of guardianship, then somebody is likely to take advantage of that. Now, what really happens deep within why somebody would take that step is not really very clear. What we do know is that people take small steps, take a little bit of a risk. So they may ask for a small bribe, and then they'll take a little bigger bribe, and then they really jump onto the bigger ones. So it does start with very small steps. It also happens in terms of learning. They begin to learn from other people how this is being done, and then try and indulge in that. And therefore, the third part is that there is something called social interactionism, which is that you begin to develop this culture कि ये तो होता ही है यहाँ पे, ऐसे होना ही पड़ता है. And therefore, you get the satisfaction that what I'm doing is not really wrong because everybody seems to be doing about it. That's the only way to survive in this organization. So it's that kind of a spiraling situation that begins to cascade and ultimately becomes very big. And therefore, as Suhas and everybody else has been saying, that you have to start right at the bottom and say that I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be part of that. I'm going to stand against that. And as the example that I gave you, that if even one person stands very firmly, then the whole thing immediately begins to collapse. So that could be the best answer.
Thank you, Arvind. Any other questions or comments or observations? Please feel free. Don't tell me the panelists have been so good that every doubt, every question has been resolved. Or it has been so bad that nothing has been resolved. So they've had too many questions to ask. Right? So we conclude? Oh, sure.
Okay, my question is to Mr. Chandra. As you've been leading to BSF and you must be having factories all around India, and there are often instances where government regulatories or local authorities often do not give permissions or put you under pressure to do specific kind of activities, CSR and all, under the name of CSR. And you know it is not ethical or it is not feasible for the ethical companies, especially German MNCs, to to go out of the way and do it. So how do you tackle this out of your experience? How do you handle the situations where we are under tremendous pressure from the local authority to do certain acts which is not ethical in nature? Thank you.
Actually, when such situations arise, every company and the managerial personnel will dig into their past. There will be precedents that have taken place, and they set the standards for the future. So for management, every incident and every request or every demand must be viewed extremely seriously and considered as the one-off situation to stop and curtail and cut off. Now that brings tremendous amount of pressure on the organization, because do we then look at stop? Do we look at it as our end all? But my recommendation is that's the way to do it. Because when a very serious situation is being crystallized to you, if as management you stand up, then the laws of negotiation bring that if two parties are involved and one party is steadfast to stand up for what it is, the laws work in favor that the other party has to give in. This is the art of the law of negotiation. Now in this particular case, what happens is, it will cost us time, but over a period of time, reputation goes around that this is not an organization and these are not the kind of people with whom we can do it. And the political system, then the environment, they readjust itself to come in to a calibration with the company, with the calibration of the situation. So whenever such a situation comes, management must take a very, very tough stand. And we can talk it afterwards, I've had running the largest chemical company in India, a 14,000 crore company with 7 chemical manufacturing units across the country. When a shipload of material is being unloaded in Kandla and a highly radioactive material is being flown into Chennai, and at the last minute, when a 75 crore worth of material is at stake, and when a demand comes, the whole organization internationally gets touched up. The easiest way for you would have been to say, look, let me pause this time and take the action next time. But that's the fatality you would do. And I will share with you how I stood up to chief ministers. And everybody said that, look, that's the end of your story. We will not have you anymore. Everybody thought that I will lose my job as a managing director because he's the most powerful chief minister. But I must tell you that over a period of time, I survived and I completed my 3 terms, 15 years as CMD.
Yeah, Suhas, you wanted to say something on this?
There are currently about 2 sides to one other enactment, the Right to Information Act. There are 2 sides, as I'm saying, because on one hand, like what Professor Arvind Verma said, prior to RTI coming into force, an officer, an inspector, used to take from you a hafta, which was like 40,000 per annum, 50,000 per annum. After the RTI came in, he said, if my job is at stake, I'm going to raise my stake. It no longer remained 40,000. It went into multiples of 10s and 20s. Why I'm saying this example in answer to your question is therefore, a withholding of a permit or a consent is no longer an element which is below the threshold of, let's say, $90 that was permitted under FCPA. It's no longer below that threshold. So the corruption levels have gone up, and therefore you will have ability to use RTI to cull out similar precedent and say, please tell me the reason why my permission or consent is not being given. Under RTI, I think they will be forced to kind of answer to you, and that's the pressure that you can utilize. So it worked both ways. It increased the threshold of corruption, but it gives you a tool now to say that, please tell me, I've sent you 4 reminders, my application is complete in all respect. And that's where we are coming back to the question of transparency and digitization. I think it's very important, especially in light of the Prevention of Corruption Act and its amendment, that be transparent. If you have made your application with all particulars in place, and if your consent is not forthcoming, okay, you have various remedies available, but corruption is not going to be the easiest route hereafter. It was an easy route some time back. It's not going to be easy route hereafter.
very correctly said, coming back to this, I'm glad you reminded me of this, because digitization is something that the enforcement officers and regulatory officers are the happiest about. They're happiest about because it makes their job very simple. You know, you leave your digital footprints everywhere. And now everything is online. Every filings have to be done online. So it is all there, and all you need is cyber forensics to fish out data, to prosecute, to send you notices, or whatever. So if you have any further questions, yeah, Arun, yeah, please go ahead, Arun, pleasure. Can anybody give a mic to Arun, please?
My name is
Arun Kulkarni.
My name is Arun Kulkarni and work for Legacies. I have a question. It is said generally that mother of all corruption is election in this country, because we elect a person and he gets into power, and whatever investment he has done in the election, so-called, he has to recover from the people. So obviously he starts getting it from the bureaucrats. It is an open fact, it's very openly said here that I don't mention the department of the government, but if you have to be a commissioner of particular department in a particular city, you have to pay as high as about 10 crores. So how would this man recover his investment, which has done 10 crores to get that position? And obviously it goes to the politician who is the master of him. So in all this, in the entire panel discussion, there was no reference of this corruption, which is very high. In other countries we have seen, like as late as yesterday, we saw that Israel's prime minister's wife was booked for corruption. In India, we don't see that happening at all. So how do you tackle this? We are talking of corporate, 1 KMP, and we are trying to protect them, but the whole country has been sucked by those people.
Yeah, Arun, I think let's focus on where this money, this 10 crore that somebody wants to pay to the minister to get the commissioner's position, where is this 10 crore going to come from? It's going to come from somewhere from the corporate sector against something that will be doled out to somebody. So the attempt on this enactment is to prevent that supply side of corruption today. Okay, it's fine on a moralistic and ethical ground to say that there should be no corruption anywhere, and even especially including the government departments within. It's fine. I mean, when you're talking about democracy and when you're talking about spending on elections and the corruption that kind of funds the election today, I think one of the manner in which you look at it to say that, and that was one of the objectives of the demonetization, to say that the cash in the economy needs to come down and needs to funnel back into non-cash economy or the proper white economy. That was the main objective of the demonetization. Having said that, I think election funding will continue to remain a problem, but you curb the supply side. This enactment or the Amendment to Prevention of Corruption Act is aiming to curb the supply side completely. And that's where I think the solution would be, if you do not have supply of cash or supply of corrupt money or bribery, then where is the question of that chain going forward anyway?
So, but would you like to add something to it from the point of view of the resolution law?
Yes, right. You know, that's what we have been talking, and we have mentioned in a book that all the rules, regulations, anti-corruption agencies, their functions are structured in a way that you will only try and crack down upon lower level corrupt behavior rather than the structures that begin to sort of promote corrupt practices. And now clearly election financing is one such major source, because I was in one state earlier, and the commissioner was informing that in a state there were recent elections and the average money that an MLA had to spend for fighting the election was 25 crores. Oh, yeah, 25 crore for an MLA, and he said that that was a kind of a minimum one, and it keeps on going higher and higher, and obviously now the demands have started coming in to start fulfilling that. What I want to suggest is, I want to call it a little moralistic, if you give me just about a few minutes. I call it the avatar phenomena. The avatar phenomena is that right from the beginning of human civilization, people have looked for an avatar who will come and sort of clean up the ages. कि मसीहा आएंगे और प्रॉफिट आएंगे और अभी तो कलयुग चल रहा है, कलयुग का अंत तभी होगा जबकि भगवान जो है वो अवतार लेकर आएंगे और सारे दुष्टों का जो है सफाया करके एक सतयुग यहाँ पे स्टैब्लिश करेंगे. So that avatar phenomena is always there, that we are waiting for somebody else to sort of take that action rather than try and use the mechanisms that we have in order to deal with it. Fortunately, we are a democracy. And then democracy is, as I mentioned in my other panel, that we should not wait for the political will to reform the system, because it has to be a people's will. And there are certain mechanisms that have been that have taken place from which we can take lessons. I mentioned earlier that there is something called the progressive movement that started in the United States, which was again exactly in this particular time period when America had become completely corrupt. Political system was extremely compromised, and it was a coterie that used to rule, something called Tammany Hill, which used to control the democratic process. And the way to combat that was that people started complaining against it. They wanted ethics in politics, they wanted an ethical society, and therefore they demanded that this political system should be reformed. And the reformation was a very simple step. What they did was to start the primaries. So primary is now that nobody can really give a ticket for a particular candidate to stand for election on a political party, because it is the local party that determines who will get the ticket from that particular region. And that quickly killed the coterie out there. So we have had demands of primaries here in Indian elections also, and I think this is something that we start demanding, and I don't see any reason why this cannot become a big movement. Now, how will that come through, we'll have to see. But it has to be done by us, not by any avatar.
Yeah, so but Arun, coming back to your point, exactly this is the point that we've tried to make in the book also, and that is my experience, that what has happened today is that in terms of fighting corruption, if you see it, and it's no rocket science, you don't have to be in the IPS to understand it, you have 2 or 3 agencies in a state, and 2 or 3 agencies at the center. Anything goes wrong anywhere in the government, any department, bhej do, send it. And the department has no role to play. So the result is that all these agencies are getting overloaded with number of cases, after cases, after cases. And as I proved empirically in the book from my data, that almost 30% cases are only investigated, 70% cases remain pending. So in the name of combating corruption, or bribery, there is hardly anything. But maybe this is not the forum for it. But the forum, what we are trying to say here is that whether we like it or not, whether it is a good act or not, whether it is, there could be improvements in the act, that is of a different domain. The moment the act is notified, things will start happening. My question to you, would you wait for that date to be notified, or taking from these sessions, these discussions that we have had, whatever thoughts we have put across to you, the legislation that we have put across to you, shouldn't you start going back and start taking measures, start finding out ways and means of sensitizing? In fact, Mr. Chandran, I was surprised, he was just narrating during tea time that when he met a number of industrialists, top industrialists, managing directors and CEOs in Mumbai, and started talking about this new corruption law, they said, what new corruption law? So there is a lot of ignorance going on. And this is exactly the idea behind this Compliance 1010 program, that we hold this kind of very topical subject so that we sensitize our compliance professionals that this is something that we have to take forward. If there are no more questions, I think, Yes, Amit, go
I
ahead.
just have one question to Professor Arvind. Professor, I work in Legacies. My name is Amit. We appreciate the examples you took about this US and Germany and Japan, developed nations. Germans can't go and have a coffee. Japanese won't go and have a coffee because it will bring shame to their organization, their family. These people have these nations have their own challenges, and those challenges cannot be compared to challenges that India has. In India, police officers' salary is pittance, as we all know. Initially, they take a bribe to meet their need, and gradually needs become greed. So in this culture, in this situation, how do we make a culture, how do we inculcate a culture that in India, people start behaving, the police officers start behaving the way they're behaving in Japan and Germany?
That's an excellent question. One that I have to confront every time when I come and speak about. This is America, that is Germany, that is Japan, and on and on. And we are Indians, and obviously this doesn't apply to us. These are the examples that I'm giving is kind of an ideal situation, that there are societies and countries and organizations where they have been able to achieve something. So that's the kind of an ideal that we would want to move towards that. Now, how we want to implement that is something that is not really that impossible, largely because we are a democracy, and therefore we have this sort of a system where ultimately the power resides with the people. Today the situation is that no political party is in a position to sort of guarantee that they are going to come back to power. So that is a really sort of a important thing, that they also know that their position is a little uncertain. They don't have that kind of a monopoly anymore. I also want to remind you that there was a time, now we may say they were different politicians, but this was in our country itself. In the 1950s, India was one of the only developing country that was absolutely clean. I had a meeting with Professor Lloyd, Susan, and Ralph Noyd. They are the doyens of sort of Indian studies in America. Then they came in 50s and met sort of interacted and sort of started doing research here. They were surprised that the political system was absolutely clean, the bureaucracy was absolutely clean, and they could take decisions and on and on. They were trying to build this zeal of ideal of building a new India. That was our country, and of course, so we can't say that, well, we have diverted so much that we can't go back into our path.
So, yeah,
And therefore the stake is that we have to get into that particular path. And as I say, each one of us has to strive that, and we have to learn from others to try and see how we can do that. Germany, Japan, everybody was also a very dangerous country, as we know. They had a very terrible system, and they had to come through fire to sort of build that particular one. They learned it through the hard way. We have an opportunity to learn it in our own way without getting into that sort of violence.
However, with due regard to you, Amit, I can tell you there is a lot of corruption in the police in the US. And as far as drug is concerned, let me tell you, the drug mafia and all, we may call it Hafta system, they might be having some nomenclature for it. But ladies and gentlemen, if you have no more questions, I think we have overshot our time. Thank you very much for your patience, patient listening, hearing. I hope some useful hints and suggestions have been given to you, and you will be able to act upon them. Thank you very much.
Thank you all our panelists for taking this wonderful discussion ahead. I would like to request Mr. Ramesh Sharma to hand over a small token of appreciation to all the panelists. Thank you so much. We'll we'll have a 10 minutes comfort break and we'll get back to another panel shortly. Thank you.